Hey everyone. We're here, the very last video lesson of Social 30-1. We are going to be talking about Unit 4, which is two chapters in the textbook, but rather than doing two different chapter lessons, we're going to do all of Unit 4 together. Unit 4 is all about ideologies shaping citizenship and shaping citizenship action. So, to start us off, we're going to talk about worldviews. Worldview and ideology shape your role as a citizen. When you react to an issue in your community or see the news, two factors influence your response: your worldview, your view of how the world is and how it should be, and your ideology. Your ideology dictates to you what should be done to bring about your vision for how society should operate. If slash how you contribute to your community is dependent on where you come from and your worldview, what ideologies have shaped your thoughts, and the kind of events you have had to respond to in your society. So, to understand our worldview as citizens and the ideological perspectives as citizens, we need to know, how does one become a citizen? And so, generally, there are two kind of key principles for citizenship that are followed around the world. Not everyone follows these um, to the same extent. And both of them are written in Latin. So, just soil means the right of the soil, and just sangrius means the right of blood. So, just soil or the right of the soil means that a person's citizenship or nationality is determined by their place of birth. So, for example, I was born in Canada, which gives me the right of Canadian citizenship. And there are some countries where if my parents were traveling at the time and I was born in that country, then I would have citizenship to that country. Not all countries have this rule, but a lot do, and Canada is one of them. And then the right to blood is the citizenship or nationality of a child is the same as the natural parents, regardless of where the child is born. So, for example, if my parents were traveling, let's say to Australia, and I was born in Australia, I would have Australian citizenship under the right of soil. And because of Canada's rules, I would also have citizenship in Canada through the right of blood because both of my parents are Canadian citizens. Okay. Same thing if you've ever heard of dual citizenship, where you have citizenship in multiple places. If one of your parents is a citizen of a country that does of blood, then that child has a right to citizenship of that place. So, for example, my mom, one of her parents is a Canadian citizen. One of her parents was born in the United States and has American citizenship as well as Canadian citizenship, and she was born here in Canada. So she has Canadian citizenship under the right of the soil. And if she ever wanted American citizenship, she could have dual citizenship or both citizenship in both places. So to some, citizenship is a matter of solely where you are born or where your parents are born, your heritage, and your past. To others, citizenship is a matter of where you live and work, your present loyalty, and where you see your future. So, for example, here in Canada, we have a number of immigration policies. So, you can immigrate to Canada as a refugee, under the family class, or under the economic class as a skilled worker. So, lots of people view that as an active form of citizenship. Those people. I don't want to say those people, but people immigrating from other countries into Canada can have citizenship here in Canada because of our structure of immigration. It's not always the case. When I did my second teaching practicum, I did it in Bermuda. And Bermuda has very, very strict citizenship rules. So even if you're born there, even if you immigrate there and live there for a really long time, there are a number of rules and requirements that you have to meet, and multiple requirements. So they might be both your parents have to be Bermudian. You have to live there for so many amount of years. So, for example, you can't be born in Bermuda and have Bermudian parents, and then they move and you be raised somewhere else. You actually need to spend most of your life in Bermuda to be able to have and retain that Bermudian citizenship. Citizenship can also reflect what kind of society you wish to support, what society offers the greatest benefits to you, and what obligations and duties societies require of you. So, for example, in Canada, where we are struggling with like a skilled workforce, we may be a lot more open to immigration than a society like Bermuda, where it's a very small island, space is very limited, and not everyone who wants to live there can live there. And so you can see the two different societies have chosen two different ways to go about citizenship because they're very different places. So, on the next couple of slides are some global issues. And as we're watching them, I would really like you to identify your worldview on this issue, identify what you think should be done regarding this issue. And as you're thinking of that, you are acting as a global citizen, a person of this earth who has power to make change. So, the first issue we're going to talk about is the war in Ukraine. So, if you have been watching the news, it is 2022. You would have heard a lot about um, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Um, and so there are varying things that citizens and societies can do to address the impacts of this war and this conflict. And so think about that as we watch this video.
Специальной военной операции.
Putin called this a special military operation, but it's clear this is a full-scale invasion.
Была паника, истерика, слезы.
Как у нас пламя было выше дома.
We're like in a cellar. I'm not sure if it's like deep enough to help us to survive.
Russian troops and tanks have entered Ukraine on all fronts. All these cities are under attack, including the capital of Kyiv, which has become Putin's main target. Many are sheltering in basements and metro stations across Ukraine. There have been hundreds of casualties, and over 500,000 Ukrainians have been forced to flee their homes. This is one of Europe's largest wars since World War II. Since then, Europe's map has been shaped by political alliances. But now, Putin wants to redraw Europe's map by force.
Современная Украина целиком и полностью была создана Россией.
Putin has long claimed Ukraine belongs to Russia and they are one people.
We're not just close neighbors, we're one nation.
But Ukraine is a sovereign nation with its own language, culture, and political system. And while the two countries do have a shared history, Ukraine has fought hard for its own identity. Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries. In 1917, the Russian Revolution brought down the empire and the region spiraled into a civil war. Ukraine briefly gained independence from Russian rule, but was quickly taken over by the newly created Soviet Union as one of its first republics. Over the next decade, the Soviet Union brutally expanded its control, and by the end of World War II, it forged a sphere of influence over here, while the West held its influence over here, essentially dividing Europe and marking the beginning of the Cold War. The Soviet Union installed communist governments on their side, which were easy for them to control. But the West developed into democracies with capitalist economies. The deep ideological divide fueled distrust and tensions between the two sides, and soon these spheres hardened into military alliances. In 1949, these countries, along with the US and Canada, formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, and promised to defend each other from invasion. A few years later, these countries joined the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact alliance, and each side built up its military to protect itself from the other. Europe remained this way for decades, until one side finally collapsed. By late 1991, republics like Ukraine began declaring independence from Soviet domination. The Soviet Union dissolved into 15 independent countries, including a much weaker Russia. And the Soviet sphere of influence disappeared as many countries overthrew their communist governments. Even though the Cold War ended, the alliance on the other side of Europe was still going strong. In fact, it was expanding. In 1999, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined NATO. In 2004, 7 more countries joined. That moved NATO into the old Soviet sphere of influence, making NATO's border with Russia the longest it's ever been. Belarus, Ukraine, and Georgia were now the last post-Soviet countries left between Russia and NATO. But Ukraine and Georgia both wanted to join NATO for a long time, and that made them prime targets for Russia. Ukraine became a NATO partner in 1994, which brought them a step closer to becoming a member.
Україна буде в НАТО. Це історична подія для нашого народу.
And in 2013, they reached an association agreement with the European Union. But when it came time to sign the deal, Ukraine's pro-Russian government refused. Instead, they chose to strengthen ties with Russia. After the decision was announced, hundreds of thousands of protesters took to the streets to demand the agreement be signed. After months of peaceful protests, the Ukrainian president cracked down and killed more than 100 people, sparking more protests, which eventually drove the president out of office and the country. This meant Putin was losing political influence over Ukraine. So he decided to use force instead. First, he invaded and annexed Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula. Then, Russia-backed separatists captured the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk and declared them independent of Ukraine. Since then, Ukraine has been locked in a conflict with Russia that has killed 14,000 people and displaced nearly 2 million. For nearly 8 years, Putin has held on to these regions, destabilizing Ukraine and keeping it from moving closer to the West. But in November 2021, Putin decided to go all in. Satellite images showed at least 100,000 Russian troops and military equipment piling up along the border of Ukraine. Putin repeatedly denied any plans to invade. But weeks later, he presented his demands to the West. His main demand was that NATO stop expanding and move its military borders back to where they were in 1997, away from Russia's. Western leaders rejected his demands. Instead, they put forces on standby and reinforced their military presence in Eastern Europe. Back at Ukraine's border, Russian troops continued to gather. And over here, along its border with Belarus, Russia began conducting huge military drills. On February 21st, the threat of war became real.
Считаю необходимым принять уже давно назревшее решение. Незамедлительно признать независимость и суверенитет Донецкой Народной Республики и Луганской Народной Республики.
His troops immediately crossed the Ukrainian border into Russian-backed separatist regions under the pretense of peacekeeping. Ukraine announced a state of emergency, and President Zelensky made a direct appeal to the Russian people.
Война лишит гарантий всех. Гарантий безопасности не будет больше ни у кого. Кто от этого пострадает больше всего? Люди. Кто этого не хочет больше всего? Люди. Кто может этого не допустить? Люди.
Hours later, on February 24th, Putin launched a full-scale invasion in Ukraine.
Специальной военной операции.
World leaders have spoken out against Russia's invasion.
We condemn this barbaric attack and the cynical arguments to justify it.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences.
Anti-war protests have broken out around the world, including in Russia, despite the risk of arrest. Neighboring nations have opened their borders as hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians attempt to flee. NATO's response force has been activated for the first time in history, and the US has sent additional troops to Eastern Europe. But in many ways, the world is treading carefully. Putin controls the world's largest arsenal of nuclear weapons and has already threatened anyone who might interfere.
Кто бы ни пытался помешать нам, должны знать, что ответ России будет незамедлительным и приведет вас к таким последствиям, с которыми вы в своей истории еще никогда не сталкивались.
So countries around the world are imposing some of the harshest economic sanctions to slow Putin down and sending tons of military aid to support Ukraine. For now, Russian forces keep pushing deeper, but Ukraine is fighting back.
Захищаємо нашу незалежність, нашу державу. І так буде й далі.
Okay, so this issue seems huge, right? Too massive for individual citizens to take action to kind of support this, right? And there are various things that individuals can do, right? They can do big things. They can house a refugee family that's coming from Ukraine. They can phone government, write letters to government, protest, all of those pieces. And then the government can take action as well, right? So you saw that the governments are taking action in terms of economic sanctions against Russia, providing Ukraine with military like weapons and supplies. They can't really go in there and fight with Ukraine because then Russia will declare war on them. And I saw a couple of very interesting things that people were doing to kind of support Ukraine and support the people of Ukraine. One example was people were ordering food from Ukrainian businesses and not necessarily eating the food or anything like that, but just supporting that business and basically saying this food can go to anyone who needs it, right? And that's an individual citizen action that people are trying to make a difference.
Мною принято решение.
Wait, the next kind of global issue is extreme poverty. And this is something that we're grappling with in every single country, whether that be an urban homeless population or a rural homeless population. It's something that we see here in northern Alberta. It's something we see when we travel to the bigger cities. And it's something that we're seeing around the world, especially when we're talking about extreme poverty.
School should never be a privilege. Water should never be a luxury. Medicine, food, housing, one should never be at the expense of the other. Today, over 1 billion people live in extreme poverty, surviving on little more than $1 a day. Mothers give birth around the world knowing that giving life puts their own at risk. Farmers choose between hungry mouths to feed today or stronger seeds for next year's harvest. Every choice a trade-off, every trade-off a potential disaster. Extreme poverty is not a precise measure of income. It's not a number of calories per day. It is the denial of basic freedoms and basic human dignity. Extreme poverty has always existed, but it is not inevitable. For the first time in human history, the end of extreme poverty is within our reach. We are already halfway there. We can end extreme poverty by 2030. Because of the progress already being made, we sit at a unique intersection where, with the brightest minds from around the globe, it is possible. When we create a world free from extreme poverty, we restore dignity and freedom and liberate people from the choices they should never have to make. Choose to become part of the movement that will allow more than 1 billion people to lift themselves out of poverty, live better lives, contribute more, and make the world healthier and safer. Choose, follow, like, end poverty.
So that video, quite a bit different than the other video because this is an ad, right? This is an ad for an aid company that provides aid in countries where a substantial population is affected by extreme poverty, right? So as you saw that ad, you may have felt, oh, I really feel the urge to help or contribute to this aid organization, or no thanks. It's totally based on your worldview, your ideology. Some people may want to travel, some people may want to contribute, anything like that. So go to the next slide. The shark fin ban. This is a really interesting one. And so basically, certain countries are looking at the possibility or have already banned the sale and consumption of shark fins because of the killing of sharks. So here's a video about a young woman who's trying to stop it.
For Madison Stewart, life started on the world's largest coral reef.
Madison's love for the sea goes all the way back to when she was a toddler. When she was 2, we were living on a yacht and just sailing through the Great Barrier Reef. We used to go to isolated coral reefs in the Great Barrier Reef, and that was building up her appetite to get into scuba. And it was like she was marking off the days on the calendar. She only had 5 years to mark off. She couldn't wait.
Probably logged my first 100 dives, mainly in the Great Barrier Reef. And I was diving there for the first time when I was 12 years old. And I've been going there ever since.
But Madison's childhood paradise is slowly changing, and not for the better. Growing pressure from overfishing, rising temperatures, and pollution are damaging one of the most diverse marine systems on Earth. During little more than Madison's lifetime, the reef has lost nearly half its coral. And now the very creature that keeps the reef healthy is threatened too.
When I was 14, that was the time when I was noticing a difference in shark populations. And I was scrutinized by many people for saying this, but I wasn't the only one, and I want to see an end to shark fishing in the Great Barrier Reef.
Standing back and just watching her sharks disappear was not an option for Madison. Madison resorts to guerrilla tactics to get her message across. The target? The shark fin soup market.
Starting up. This is the most essential part of what I do. Show people who don't know about these places or can't visit them or are too scared of sharks to do so. we're bringing the sharks to them. I'm very excited to see how it works and the kind of reaction we get. We are actually doing this in the middle of a shark fin district, so let's see how it works out. So good?
Right on time for the dinner crowds to arrive, it's time to break a few rules. Madison's about to cook up a storm in Chinatown. The shark fin soup special is ready for its premiere.
Hey guys, you found shark finning? Talking to people on the street is one of the best things you can do, but footage is also powerful, so how do you put two together? You project your footage onto the side of a building where people are walking on the street opposite. It's always been a dream, and to see it actually happen is phenomenal. We're trying to educate people about shark finning and shark fin soup, because there are a lot of people at the moment that are pushing for the banning the trade of shark fins. It should be, it's good? Yeah.
Okay, think about what you thought about that video. It's a young woman who's kind of taking her role as a citizen, really important, and kind of using her ability to speak to people and to show people her worldview and her concerns, right? One thing that really struck me in terms of like my worldview when I was watching this is she didn't quite address the cultural component of shark fin and shark fin soup because it's a food that is consumed by a specific cultural group. And when someone who isn't a part of that cultural group is criticizing that cultural practice, I think a little bit more reflection has to happen. And then also, she clearly comes from a bit of a place of privilege. You saw her being able to go out on a very fancy, very expensive boat to be able to go dive into the ocean and swim around the Great Barrier Reef. And it also takes quite a bit of money to be able to afford to protest the way that she protests, right? With a big fancy external projector and the van and the generator. So those are things in terms of my worldview that I reflected on. I don't know what kind of things you guys reflected on based on your worldview. And the final kind of global issue that we're going to be talking about is the civil war that's been going on in Syria for quite some time.
Half a decade of uninterrupted violence, 370,000 deaths, and more than 11 million people displaced from their homes. That's like the entire state of Ohio. There's no end in sight. Syria devolved from peaceful demonstrations opposing an authoritarian regime in 2011 to a full-blown civil war. It's seen the rise of the Islamic State and outside superpowers drawn into the carnage. The result? The biggest humanitarian crisis in the world. So here's the situation. Since 1966, the Alawite minority, an offshoot of Shiite Islam, have been in power in Syria. This despite the fact that Alawites represent just 12% of the Syrian population. The Sunni Muslim population, however, represents around 60%. The current president, Bashar al-Assad, an Alawite, took over in 2000 after the death of his father, Syria's longtime ruler, Hafez al-Assad. Cut to 2011 and the Arab Spring. The world watched as uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt quickly toppled their respective dictators. Inspired by these events, Syrians took to the streets to protest the oppressive rule of Bashar al-Assad. But instead of stepping down, Assad violently crushed the peaceful uprisings using tanks, artillery, and gunships. Many of the protesters responded by arming themselves. That's when the conflict took on a sectarian nature. Sunnis from other parts of the Middle East, like the Saudis, threw their backing behind the rebels. Shiites, like the Iranians, gave their support to the regime. Meanwhile, the jihadists of the Islamic State, which used the turmoil to seize territory, attacked both sides. Then there are major powers like the US and Russia. After a poison attack in 2013, the US and Russia cooperate to get UN inspectors to destroy Syria's known chemical weapons. But in general, the two powers have skewed in very different directions over this war. Simply put, the US is against Assad and Russia supports him. Russia has used its UN Security Council veto repeatedly to protect the regime. Both countries are actively fighting inside Syria against Islamic State and an al-Qaeda spin-off in the name of combating terrorism. But Russia uses the terrorist tag to bomb other groups opposing Assad, including rebels supported by the US and its allies. Finally, there are the Syrian civilians in the middle of all of this. Devastated by the fighting and destruction, Syrians are fleeing by the millions into neighboring countries, straining resources and creating a global refugee crisis. Now here's the argument. The US and Russia agree on the need to end the war, but not on how. For years, the US has insisted Assad must go, but has since softened its stance on the dictator in the interest of the broader fight against the Islamic State. Meanwhile, Russia says it wants to keep Syria sovereign and independent by backing Assad. Several efforts to resolve the conflict through negotiations have failed. Neither side has had enough of an advantage in this war to get the other to compromise on terms for peace, nor has either been willing to do so for the sake of Syria.
So again, based on your worldview, you're going to have perspectives on the events occurring in Syria and possible actions that you may take as an individual citizen. Right? So again, this has been occurring for quite some time, and Canada has taken in hundreds of thousands of refugees from Syria because of this conflict. And whether or not you support that is based on your perspectives and your worldview. Okay, moving on, we're going to talk about a couple more things that relate to citizenship and ideology. One of them being respect for law and order. So one responsibility that often comes from citizenship is to obey the laws of the community in which you live. These laws are part of a contract we agree to follow as citizens of a community. Laws can be adapted from citizen feedback. A justice system, police officers, judges, prosecutors ensure that laws are followed. Political participation as a citizen. A desire on citizens to effect change may encourage citizens in a democratic country to participate in the political process. You could write a letter, you can circulate a petition, you can organize a protest, you can take issue to the Human Commission of Rights, you can run for office, you can join or support a political party, and of course you could vote. You could join an interest group like Amnesty International, I Don't Know More, any of those. You can help fundraise for an interest group. There are tons of ways to politically participate as a citizen. And you can also protest and practice civil disobedience. So the freedom to question the decisions made by our government is an important element of democracy. When people feel their voices are not being heard, demonstrations or protests are often organized. Civil disobedience is the nonviolent action taken against something perceived as unjust. I also wanted to kind of add a little bit about some citizenship in relation to Aboriginal participation in the First and Second World Wars. So sometimes, despite decisions made by their government, citizens as individuals or collectives take action based on their ideological convictions. In World War I and World War II, Aboriginal soldiers accepted the responsibility of Canadian citizenship, even though the Canadian government had not guaranteed them the rights of citizenship. 1914, many Aboriginal people were feeling betrayed by the Canadian government as a result of colonial policies of assimilation and discrimination. But Aboriginal people still volunteered in large numbers for the war effort. Many Aboriginal men were skilled trappers and hunters. They were often called on to act as patrol leaders, safely guiding soldiers through dangerous enemy territory. The armed forces was the only place where some Aboriginal men were treated equally in society. Unfortunately, post World War I and World War II, government benefits for Aboriginal veterans were less than those of non-Aboriginal veterans. 2001, Governor General Adrian Clarkson dedicated the Aboriginal Veterans War Monument in Ottawa, a gesture to thank Aboriginal soldiers in the role they played in fighting for Canada in several wars, not just the world wars. So I wanted to mention this because when we talk about the Indigenous peoples in Canada, citizenship for Indigenous people has always been different, right? Whether that be kind of you have citizenship with the Indigenous nation and citizenship with the country, and you're kind of grappling with those two citizenships, or being denied rights of Canadian citizens. So, for example, Indigenous people in Canada, mainly First Nations that lived on reserve, did not have the right to vote in a lot of elections, whether that be the federal election till the 1960s, the provincial elections, 1980s, and then even local municipal elections. So even though municipal affairs affects reserves, there is still no say from reserves on how and what municipalities have the power to do. Citizenship and anti-war movements. So individuals can express their citizenship in a democratic society by taking part in movements or protests against their government's decision to participate or not to participate in war. One of the biggest ones was the Vietnam War. So we would have talked about that earlier. But the biggest thing with the Vietnam War came the anti-war movement. And lots of people saw that there wasn't a need to be in Vietnam, and the war in Vietnam was more of a kind of self-interest related war rather than a humanitarian one, or one that would protect the safety of Americans. I'm just going to skip that video. So there's a couple of Unit 4 terms that are really important. You need to know what citizenship means. You need to know the right of soil, right of blood. Naturalization, which I touched on when I talked about, and that's basically the process of applying for citizenship. So any type of immigration is naturalization. Citizen advocacy, political participation, anti-war movements, civility, and pro-democracy movements. So included in your chapter or Unit 4 lesson in the Brightspace, you'll also see a handout that you can read through, which is really helpful. You can also look at chapter 13 and 14 of the textbook, which are completely optional, just kind of support your learning. And the assignment for Unit 4 is a little project where you are going to kind of look at your role as a global citizen and kind of what you could do in terms of action towards a global issue. So that is it. That is the last lesson for the course. I hope you enjoyed everything, and I hope your last bit of the project in the Unit 4 exam goes well as studying for the diploma. Goodbye.